Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this post-summit briefing and EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me, as always, delighted to have Fabian Zuleeg, CEO and Chief Economist at the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies, as we discuss the outcome of yesterday's summit and consider what that outcome tells us about whether the European Council really can move from division to delivery. As always, totally interactive session. I have some questions for Janis and Fabian. If you have a question, could you either click on the raised hands button if you'd like to speak, or write your question in the Q&A box, not the chat, and please be brief. Okay, let us get straight underway. Lots to discuss. Janis, just to set the context for us, tell us what was actually on the agenda and what did they focus on? Did they focus on the things we thought they would focus on before the summit, or were there other issues that proved stickier?
Well, they had a very long agenda, starting with the usual meeting with the European Parliament President. Then they met Zelensky, which has now become a tradition, obviously. They discussed Ukraine, where the biggest and hottest and most contested issue started to be discussed, which are the frozen assets, Russian frozen assets, and how to deal with them. By the way, all that happened without the participation of Viktor Orban. Important to notice that he was absent in the morning and also over lunch. During lunch, they discussed defense. Then they moved over to climate competitiveness. Then they had an innovation, something which had never been discussed before in the European Council, which is housing. That was one of the shortest items, but still it made it to the agenda. Then Middle East, and the dinner was Eurozone, a meeting with Lagarde. And then there was some speculation that they might come back to the contested issue of Russian assets and have another attempt to try to find a better or stronger compromise or a real compromise, but they didn't manage to do so. So you see they had a lot on the agenda. The council conclusions also include more elements than the one we mentioned, but these are the things which they actually discussed with a heavy emphasis on issues related to defense and the frozen assets.
And Fabian, in broad terms for now, and we'll come into some of the detail of this a little bit later. As I mentioned, the invitation to this update asked whether the European Council could or would move from divisions to delivery. Do you think they did? I mean, Antonio Costa, the European Council President, claimed last night, "I said today would be decision time, and we delivered on all fronts." Did they?
I think what we have seen is not really delivery. It was always a tall order to make progress on all of these items, but I would actually argue that we have seen very little progress across the board. Yes, things were discussed, but that's pretty much all we can say. And many of the key decisions have actually been postponed to a later date.
Thank you. Janis, in broad terms, do you share that analysis, or are you a little more positive about the outcome?
I think Fabian is analytically correct. But if you would have now, for example, given that you quoted in President Costa with us, he would say, we did achieve progress. We had a discussion in Copenhagen, which was an informal summit. We came to conclusions at this European Council meeting. Yes, there are things which still need to be discussed. We will discuss them partially in December. Other things will continue to be discussed also later on in 26. But there is movement. We're moving in the right direction, they would argue. So the question is, how do you actually assess that you have moved, or, as you were asking, that there actually is delivery? When it comes to delivery, I think we're still far away, because even if you agree that we want to do certain things, that doesn't mean that you will do these things. So there is this big gap between, on the one hand, this feeling notion we're moving, and the concrete question as to, is this enough? And are we moving fast enough?
Okay, we'll come back on that, but let us look in turn at the different issues, what was talked about, and indeed how far, if we want to redefine delivery as moving, how far we moved and whether we moved far enough. Let's turn first of all to Ukraine, and you mentioned, Janis, the big sticking point. Come back to that in a minute, but The traditional, as you say, now traditional address to the Council by President Zelensky. What was the focus of his remarks? And was there anything really new in it, or was it more a case of underlining the urgency of more support, both military and now, crucially, I think economically? He's increasingly, and this links to the discussion obviously about frozen assets, but increasingly Ukraine under economic pressure.
Exactly. I think the big focus, and also when you followed the press conference afterwards with Zelensky, was very much on financial aspects. Obviously, not only, but a lot of financial aspect, which was linked to the fact that there are decisions which need to be taken at the EU level, given the absence now of the Trump administration when it comes to this. But in general, I think it is all embedded also in the overall developments. The latest developments, I must say, because you don't know what the next developments potentially might bring. But if you followed, and I think we've all done that, closely, the interaction between Putin and Trump, that some at some moment thought it seemed to be progressing, and then we found out they're not progressing. They were supposed to meet in Budapest, they will not meet in Budapest. And now even economic sanctions, strong economic US sanctions which go far beyond what Europeans in certain ways have thus far been able to impose on Russia. So there's a lot of movement, and you need to embed all this into the overall situation. But what Zelensky this time really was strong about in his message was, I need more financial help. Please agree to it and find a way where actually the Russians will pay for what they did or what they're doing by forcing this war on us.
Thank you. Come back to that in a minute. But Fabian, more generally, with this, if I could call it yo-yoing from Donald Trump, I mean, we always said he'd be unpredictable, and this week has graphically illustrated that. Very tough meeting with Zelensky at the weekend. He appeared to be using Putin's speaking points. Then there was this summit. It was on, it was off. Now, as Janis mentions, sanctions on 2 Russian oil companies. I mean, is the EU reaching the stage where instead of saying, okay, we must react to whatever Donald Trump has done, we must assume that this is how it's always going to be, and we actually the Americans won't really contribute substantially in any way now to Ukraine, particularly in terms of economic support as well as military, and therefore we just have to forge ahead and sort of not be distracted by that continual change of mood?
I think it still matters whether Donald Trump and the US, by implication, are on the side of Ukraine, or whether there is a realignment, some form of accommodation with Russia. For the moment, Putin is doing us a great favor by making clear that he doesn't want peace. That makes it impossible for Trump to find some form of accommodation with him. On top of that, it's not looking good for Trump. So that's how I would interpret the reactions we are now seeing. It is anger that he's being made to look ineffective by Putin. So I think this still matters, but I think you're right. There is a baseline, and that baseline is, even under the best possible circumstances, we are not going to see the US shouldering a financial burden. If there are weapons which can be provided, like the Tomahawks, then if in doubt, the Europeans will have to pay for it. So this is something which we have to take as a given. So certainly when it comes to financial aid, we need to move ahead because we know there's not going to be money coming from elsewhere.
Indeed. We will come on in a moment to the frozen assets, but of course, 19th sanctions package was approved. Final objections to it were lifted. We sort of, maybe when these take so long between each package to get agreement on it, we maybe take it for granted. But striking in a week when as we mentioned earlier, Donald Trump has imposed sanctions on 2 Russian oil companies, one of which the EU is not sanctioning. I mean, how significant is it that they can still get these agreements on the sanctions packages? And where do we go from here on that? Would you expect to see a 20th and a 21st, Janis?
That would be my assumption. And I remember I don't know exactly when we were discussing this many months ago, a year ago, where we were saying, will there be another one? And we said, yes, this will be the continuous mode of moving from one package to the next. And already now that the 19th one has agreed, found finally full agreement, there's already discussion about what should happen next and how also to react to the US sanctions, as we said earlier. So this is a continuous process. And I think if that would not happen, I mean, if we would hypothetically now say they would not be able to agree on any additional sanction package, that would be bad news. So the fact that at least there is an agreement is something which is positive. It's difficult to be achieved. It always takes longer than you think. And it always is, at the end of the day, a compromise. And it is an attempt to push the sanction needle a bit forward. There never is an attempt to make this big, huge step, but to push things forward. And now you're being under pressure from the US to do so.
Indeed.
Let me just add one element to what Fabian was saying, because it is interesting, obviously, to follow what is happening also in the interaction between Putin and Trump. And one often has to wonder why, especially Putin is doing what he's doing. But it seems to me increasingly the fact that he is politically betting on a worsening situation within the countries or the regions of his enemies, so that there will be further divisions in the US, that the situation will become also politically, domestically more difficult in the US, and that he will be able to profit from that. That he also probably is betting on political developments within the European Union and certain member states. So I think he still believes, besides all the military questions and actions he's taken, that he still believes that in the long term, this is in his interest to keep things prolonging and to keep moving the way he is moving, and also making us feel uncertain about what his next potential move might or might not be. So I think that's part of an overall political bet he's investing in.
Fabian, you wrote to the point, one of the ABC's short, sharp commentaries this week, entitled very simply, Russia Wants War. And you were arguing, really, they've shown that Moscow has shown it doesn't want peace, and therefore curbing its ability to pursue and continue this aggression is very much in the EU's own interest, and Europe's own interest. From your perspective, the sanctions package, and how do you see it, and how do you see the move by Donald Trump in America against Russian oil companies? How significant could that be, and why are we not doing the same in the case of one of them?
Yeah, on sanctions, just to add to what Janis was saying, that I think this kind of slow process, where in the end we do get to the next package, I think actually it shows something rather positive, that even those who are holding out are actually not holding out on principle. They are holding out because there is essentially a bargain to be made. They want something specific. They also want to show their domestic audience that they are fighting for the interest. So they will hold out for some time, but so far at least we have not seen that they completely are intransigent when it comes to it. So if the right horse is on the table, then we also see the movement there. But I think the sanctions from Trump are going to be a game changer. They have a big impact, and an immediate impact. I think they are probably put in place for the wrong reasons, but we should welcome them nevertheless, because they are achieving something which so far we have failed to achieve. On top of that, and that's coming back to also the internal divisions, it's interesting that, for example, Orban, Hungary under Orban, is now trying to circumvent what the Americans are putting into place, which clearly shows that the great friendship doesn't go very far when it comes to concrete issues.
Absolutely. Before we move to the frozen assets, actually, I did want to ask a question about Hungary, because yet again, the statement on Ukraine does not form part of the main body of Council conclusions. Yet again, it is a statement at 26, because Orban simply refuses to endorse anything relating to Ukraine when it comes to these EU summit discussions. I mean, can this go on like this? Janis?
I assume that it will at least go on until election times in Hungary. Because if you follow his actions, also what happened yesterday, he gave a speech in Budapest, in Hungary, where he was extremely, again, critical, saying he's defending the interests of Hungary, the values of Hungary. So that is all part of his attempt to get reelected, where there still is a very big question mark if we will actually manage to do so this time around. So very much of this can only be understood if you also see them from that perspective. So structurally, I think everyone has written him off for the time being, has also partially left the chapter Orban behind them for the time being, because if he gets re-elected, you need to again find a modus vivendi with the Prime Minister of Hungary, if it is again Viktor Orban.
But Fabian, what does that say, or does it not matter in terms of what it says about the current EU? That on the most important issue of the day, many would argue, they cannot issue a statement at 27 on any of it.
I think clearly this is something we have seen for a number of years now. So it is not just when it comes to Ukraine, or not just Hungary for that matter. We do have a fundamental decision-making problem that many things cannot advance because structurally countries can hold out. And also other countries can hide behind them, because very often it is quite convenient to actually have someone else cast the veto. But it also means that it's not just on the more symbolic declarations, it is also on concrete issues that we cannot make progress. If we look at enlargement, for example, it is a clear case that at this moment in time, we're not moving forward as quickly as we should, and that's because of the decision-making structures we have. We are going to see it on other issues as well, including the next multi-annual financial framework. So this is a fundamental problem of the European setup.
Indeed, which has led to your calls in a paper, and then subsequently in many of our discussions, for what you call coalitions of the willing, right across I always forget how you phrase this, supra-governmental avant-garde. Did I get that right?
Open supra-governmental avant-garde.
Very
Oscar.
good.
Just say
Janis,
Oscar.
let us turn now to frozen assets. I mean, it looked in the run-up to the summit as if Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen thought they had got a deal in their sights. It looked as if, the way they talked on the way into the council, it looked as if they had satisfied the Belgian concerns about the legal and financial implications, and whether they would be liable, because Euroclear is based in Brussels, whether they would be liable if Russia challenged the decision, sued them in any way. And yet it all fell apart again. And all we have now is the Commission to present as soon as possible options for financial support, and we'll come back to this in December. Did something go horribly wrong, or were they never as near to a deal as we thought? And if not, why'd you bring it to the summit when one member state, the most affected member state, is clearly not ready to agree?
First of all, I'll start from there and then I'll go back to Belgium itself. It's not only the Belgians who have some headaches when it comes to this issue, it's also others. And let's not forget that, including also the European Central Bank. Where Lagarde herself also said that, immobilized assets that are seized must be guaranteed. So she was indicating there need to be certain guarantees, not only for Belgium, but also from a system perspective, in order not to undermine the credibility of financial markets, even of the euro potentially. So I'm just saying this, but she was ready to compromise. She was also, she said it's the right thing to do, but we need to do it in the right way. But there were also others, the French, the Spanish, the Luxembourg, before at least they went into the European Council meeting, when they said they're ready to accept an agreement. So there was this belief we're getting there. We're also getting over some of the opposition, which was coming from not only from the Belgians, but the Belgians will probably tell you, well, we do not feel that our concerns were taking into account enough. And they're also being critical of the Commission. So there is a question as to whether actually one was on the same page when getting and moving into yesterday's European Council. And as you said, if you now look into the language which came out, and it was difficult even to agree on the language of the European Council conclusions. So they were watered down immensely, immensely. To say that we will take the work forward says nothing. It doesn't give any indications. And if you compare the final conclusions to the draft European Council conclusions, they were more concrete. I'm not saying they were.
So it went wrong, or it was badly prepared in the first place?
I think both. I think both things happened. But if you look into what the Belgian Prime Minister was asking for, these things which he's asking for, actually, they're not unreasonable. So if he says we need a full mutualization of risk, if you take into account how much money this is also compared to the Belgian GDP, this is a lot of assets which are frozen and are frozen by a company which is based in Belgium. When he says we need guarantees that if the money has to pay back, that every member state would chip in. Well, if all member states agree that this is what they would do, and again, we're talking about 140, 180 billion.
Yeah.
If that's what all member states do, to say, well, you need to chip in case we get into a situation where we're legally obliged to pay and we need to pay back quickly. Or if he says that every country which is holding Russian immobilized assets should do the same or be with us, as he said. So these things are not things which are totally unacceptable. There are things that need to be discussed and where you need to find a way and a compromise. And here there seems not to have been enough preparation to be at the point where you can say, okay, now we have agreed and we need to figure out how we're going to do this concretely. So I think it's a mix of both things. And let's not forget, internal politics also plays a role here. De Wever also wanted to send a signal towards this internal.
Indeed, because of government budget negotiations here in Belgium. But just concluding this part, we need to move on to defence in a moment. But Fabian, Antonio Costa, putting what I thought was an extraordinarily positive gloss on what was clearly a failure, said, we took the most important decision. We took the most important decision, and I quote, to ensure full financial support for Ukraine. I mean, if you say in principle full financial support, but you cannot agree how to do it, because if you don't use the frozen assets, you're talking about member states coming up with money from their own coffers, which seems unlikely at the moment. I mean, it was a bit disingenuous, wasn't it, to claim the great decision and the most important decision was that we'll do it. Surely the most important decision is this is how.
Let me go first a step back, also to just emphasize it shouldn't have come to this. We shouldn't have ended up with a summit which in the end was a failure on this particular issue. There needed to be the kind of shuttle diplomacy we've seen in the past, which made sure that there was enough alignment to move towards an agreement. Maybe that was also not what some of the member states wanted, but I think it is important to recognize that this is not a good way of making European policy, because in the end, it looks bad for everybody. So now they had to find something. I would say what we have now is the bare minimum of being able to say, we haven't completely failed because the issue is still on the agenda and we have made a commitment in principle that we are going to support Ukraine. But it is a very thin fig leaf we have here. And I think at least I would hope that before the next discussion of this issue, there is a real meeting of minds behind closed doors so that we're not ending up in the same situation again.
Right. Janis, quick one if you would. I then want to move on to security and defense.
Okay. I think my working assumption would be that this is where we will end up. Should we have been now further ahead than we are? Yes. But the fact that, there's an agreement, there will be continuous financial support. Now we're talking about 26 and 27 for Ukraine, and that this is necessary, and it will definitely come, and we're ready to support Ukraine financially, is putting pressure on all of them. Because the question is, where does the money actually come from? And in moments of tight national budgets, also the Belgian national budget, which is very tight. There's a need to find the assets somewhere. So there is a strong inclination to say to use the frozen assets in a way which is secure enough from the Belgian side, from a financial market perspective. But the pressure is there, and to say we will be paying, I think, is putting additional pressure on everyone. So here I understand Costa.
Okay.
The fact is how he's communicating about this, conveying the message as if what happened yesterday did not happen, because as Fabian was saying, it was a failure.
Okay.
Or I think he said total failure.
Thank you. Let us move on to security and defence, because that's another big topic that was discussed. I also want to talk about competitiveness, and if we can, squeeze in a few words on housing before we close. But on security and defence, again, Costa, in his invitation letter to the EU leaders, talked about turning the work done this year at and in between those big informal meetings in Egmont in February, in Copenhagen in October. He talked about turning them into commitments and concrete decisions on capability, projects, and governance. And last night he said that they had delivered on this as well. Fabian, your assessment, lots of language about determined to deliver at pace and at scales, address things as a matter of priority and so on. Did this amount to a decisive move forward from your perspective?
It amounts to a decisive decision to decisively move forward. And I think in this particular case, that's not the worst possible outcome.
Okay.
I think we do have very difficult discussion when it comes to this. And there are still fundamental differences between what the member states want, especially from the EU, in this whole difficult puzzle, because we also, of course, have NATO, we have the member states' actions themselves, we have multiple arrangements between member states or non-member states and member states. So this is a very complex area where we should also recall that the EU has played a very small role in the past. So this is very new in many ways. So I think just being able to say we are moving forward on this one, I'm with Janis, that actually movement is already a form of delivery. But clearly, this is not answering the big questions, and that's ultimately what we should be focusing on. Are we moving decisively towards having the capabilities which we need, however they are going to be produced, whether that's at the member state, at EU, at NATO? It doesn't really matter. What really matters is whether we have that capability on the ground, or whether at least we have the contract signed, which actually are getting us into that area. And there, I think we are still a long way off from where we need to be. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, despite the fact that this is a difficult area.
And Costa, Janis talked about, he said, we've defined capability priorities, we've approved new financial tools, and we will finalise what they're calling capability coalitions to drive projects by the end of the year and launch projects, concrete projects in 2026. So for you, was this the culmination of a year's work or another staging post on a road which has so many staging posts? Is this, as Fabian says, one of the areas where, to use your phrase, movement is in itself a form of delivery?
Well, first of all, there has been movement, and so I agree totally with Fabian's analysis. The question is what we're doing enough? And here one can have doubts, especially when it comes to actual cooperation between member states. Coordination between member states is one thing, but actual cooperation, actually putting money into projects which are of a European nature, genuine European nature, there are still question marks. And then there's the question of, is the scale of what we're talking about big enough? And here we still have the old reflex that member states are very worried when it comes to defense. This is a core area of national sovereignty. It has to do a lot also with economic factors. So having progress in itself already is something which is of added value. Is it living up to what needs to be done? Probably not. Also, if you look into the European Council conclusions, if you also look into the Commission's / High Representative's defense readiness paper, you can clearly see that there's also a wariness among member states when it comes to the role of the Commission. And here Fabian is right. This is an area where there is no tradition, where member states have been defending themselves. And you can clearly see also in the processes which are supposed to be implemented, there is a pushback coming from member states who feel that the Commission is trying too much, and President von der Leyen is trying too much when it comes to the area of defense. And last but not least, and that's interesting because this time it was the Greek Prime Minister who spurred the debate, saying we need to have more discussion about common lending when it comes to European defense, which there was a strong pushback from other member states. And we have been discussing this, others have been discussing that you also need to think about some form of joint borrowing in order to live up to what actually needs to be done at the European level, that you, at the end of the day, can and should not avoid this debate, but this is something which member states really do not want to discuss. So they're very careful when it comes to defense. They continue to be. So for me, this is just another step in a very long marathon, where at the end of the day, we'll be able to say whether we actually were able to deliver.
Thank you. And Fabian, indeed, the Council conclusions talking about the need, and I quote, to ensure effective political oversight and coordination and intensify the work by defence ministers in the Council on Europe's defence readiness. And Costa used the words last night, member states are in the driving seat. How much of a battle royal is this for control, and how important is it? I mean, there's clearly a pushback against the Commission, but how significant is it in terms of whether it makes it more or less likely to deliver faster progress?
I wish we wouldn't focus so much on the haggling between institutions and who's at the forefront of what, but actually start off with defining what do we need to achieve, and then we can start talking about what the best instruments, the best institutions, the best organization is. But I think in this particular case, clearly member states have a certain weariness of having the Commission in particular involved in this particular area. But this is where we also have a fundamental paradox. The paradox is that we need to look at defense industry, we need to look at the single market, we need to look at all of the areas where the Commission does have competences if we want to change something about how effective our spending on defense is, which is one of the crucial priorities. And it's not just spending more, but spending it better. And there, the Commission has to have a role, given the economic competences it has. So it's sitting somewhere in between. And I think this is precisely the tension we are seeing.
Indeed. Let us move on now to competitiveness, because another major item on the agenda, they talked about simplification, they talked about climate objectives, meeting climate objectives while at the same time strengthening competitiveness, and they talked about Europe's sovereignty on digital matters. Malcolm Harbour asks us, saying, the Council took the Parliament to task for rejecting a proposal to cut red tape in EU rules. This is a reversal of Parliament's regular criticism of the Council for its failure to observe single market rules. Is the growth and competitiveness agenda having any traction with Council, or is it totally absorbed with external affairs? My understanding, Fabian, is they did want to, and this was a very substantive discussion on climate and competitiveness, and also indeed on simplification. There's some quite strong language in the case of simplification about accelerating the work. I'm very interested in your take on that tension between climate, whether this is another signal the European Green Deal is dead, or they are still trying to ride both horses. How do you read the conversation on competitiveness and the conclusions that emerged?
We've had a return to competitiveness. Clearly, it has been one of the big topics, not just in this von der Leyen term, but also beforehand. But I do think that member states, at the very least, recognize that there is political pressure at home, and in particular, that business is very much pushing for an ambitious and serious simplification agenda. What that exactly looks like, I think, is still a debate. We've had the Draghi report, the Letter report, so we've had a lot of measures which go also way beyond simplification. So when we're looking at competitiveness, we should not conflate it with simplification. They're not the same thing. But I think that member state governments are serious about it. The question is, what can you do about it at the European level? And do we have what is on the table at the moment? And there, I personally would be more skeptical, because I think what we are seeing now is a simplification agenda, but it doesn't have the wide ambition, the change of mindset, which we really need to have. And yes, it does clash with the green agenda. I don't think the Green Deal is dead. It's very hard for something to be killed at the European level in any case. But I think certainly they are riding more on the competitiveness horse than on the green horse at the moment.
Come back to that in a moment. Just a question, though, from our audience. And I don't know what the reference is. I haven't seen it, but let me give you the question. European leaders instructed the European Commission to speed up its work, quotes, as a matter of utmost priority on all files with a simplification and competitiveness dimension. The question is Politico right in claiming that, quotes, Ursula von der Leyen is selling simplification like a Kinder egg, sweet on the outside for European business with a surprise inside for the US president? I'm not quite sure what Politico meant by that. I didn't see that quote. Do you know what they meant? And is it, in a sense, trying to straddle two horses?
I mean, I didn't see the quote, but I suspect this is about the demands coming from the White House that Europe needs to get rid of some of its legislation, some of its framework, in particular on digital issues. So the idea has been put forward that we could package the two, the simplification and competitiveness agenda, together with what Trump wants. So claiming that we are delivering for Trump what he wants, essentially that he leaves us alone. I think this, from my perspective, would be if you can sell this credibly, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I just have my doubts whether this is what would satisfy someone like Donald Trump. I think this is highly technical and complex. There are very few people in Europe who really understand what is behind the headlines.
Yeah, it's that conflating of the digital issues, for example, the EU's rules and Digital Service Act and so on, with the simplification agenda that you think is the
So if we can sell this to Donald Trump to say that we have met your demands, and he credibly believes that, or he claims to believe it, then that's great. I just have my doubt that that would work.
Janis, just on the strategic debate that the EU leaders had on climate objectives while simultaneously pursuing European competitors, there is a lot of language in the Council. There's a lot of words like being realistic, being cost efficient. Antonio Costa afterwards was talking about making sure the transition is just and affordable, guarantee that it contributes to a strong industrial base. What does all this mean? And most concretely, there is a discussion going on at the moment about the 2040 emission targets. What does all this mean for that? Did we get a clear signal now from the Council about what they want the outcome of that discussion on the targets to be? And more broadly, do you, Fabian says it's quite hard to kill anything once it's the EU has launched it. Is your sense that we're moving further and further away from the Green Deal if we're not killing it, or that genuinely there is an attempt to ride both horses?
I think there is partially an attempt to ride both horses, but at the same time, there's a fundamental pushback against the Green Deal. The way in which this is being phrased, and even if these phrases are not being used, the Green Deal should not be a religion. We need to really think about our competitiveness in a global environment, which has become much more complex and difficult. Fabian was describing this with respect to the US. So it's a combination of many different things. And by the way, it's also motivated by very different elements. You already were referring to the fact that the European Council conclusions are very long when it comes to this issue. Simplification and competitiveness, green and digital, 5 pages. And they stick more or less to what had been pre-prepared compared to other areas where they were having discussion, as we were mentioning earlier. And there was opposition coming from very different actors. So there were some, like the Germans and the Slovak, who even Fico and Matt's meeting before the European Council, pushing when it comes to the combustion engine. You had the Italians being pushing for something, the French pushing for other things. It was a whole amount of different member states, probably around 10, who were pushing for different things. Which also, I think there was a conscious decision not to then reflect that in the European Council conclusion, but because they feared they would have blown up everything. So this just shows that there is a strong political push in the direction, with simplification also being very strong as a headline. And there's a strong push, by the way, also towards the European Parliament, as Malcolm Harbour was mentioning. Metsola, leaving the meeting with the European Council members, was saying afterwards, and I'm quoting, not quoting him, I'm just using my own words, yes, paraphrasing, that, okay, I got the message. You want the European Parliament to agree on certain simplification decisions. We didn't manage to do it this week, and I'll try my best to get that together, which also means that we need to look for unconventional coalitions within the European Parliament. If you translate that, is you open towards the extreme, whoever it is, to help you to get things over the green line when it comes to simplifying. And that's what actually the European Council is asking us to do. So there is a strong political push in the direction we have been indicating. And I think that this is going to become even stronger. By the way, there seems to be an agreement that at the February informal European Council meeting, they will come back to competitiveness. So they want to keep this issue, and simplification, sorry. And they want to keep this issue high on the agenda. Having said all that, they're approaching the issue from particular perspectives, from particular national interests, and from particular perspectives. So to use a word which we have been using in the past and Fabian used earlier, if this is about having a totally new mindset when it comes to competition, this is not what they are discussing. They're discussing how are we going to get what we actually want. And it's not about, how are we going to implement Letta and how we're going to potentially implement Draghi. We're going to invite him. We're going to listen to them again. But actually, at the end of the day, they're not ready to move in that direction because that would require something much more fundamental, and not ready to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Just one other issue they talked about, or certainly there's summit conclusions on it, whether they discussed it in any length or not, I'm not clear, about Europe's sovereignty on digital matters. Fabian, when we talk about tech sovereignty, digital sovereignty, what are we really talking about? What did EU leaders focus on, and what do we need to be focused on? It seemed to be much of the conversation about, or the conclusions are about, driving innovation in the digital space, cybersecurity, and the single market. But what do they really mean? What we go back to the conversation earlier about Donald Trump as well. What does it mean, and what are they really talking about doing?
It's a very good question because I'm not sure that there is a lot of clarity what all of this is about. There are different elements. Certainly, one of the elements is about, in Europe, effectively regulate tech. Does it have the power? Does it have the freedom of movement to effectively rein in these the big US tech companies? But there's also the question which links more into competitiveness, into where we are in the global economy. Are we actually at the forefront of these technologies? Are we the drivers behind this global tech revolution, which clearly is not the case? So if that is our definition of tech sovereignty, we've already lost it, because we are nowhere to be seen when it comes to most of these key enabling technologies, which we're seeing now. And the third element is the question of the security angle to this. Clearly, technology is one of the key areas for economic security. So are we able to deal with the security challenges which come, for example, with dependence of our technologies, our industry on certain other countries? So all of these elements are in there somewhere. But when you put it all together, unfortunately, the answer is I would at least argue that we don't have a very high degree of tech sovereignty on any of those dimensions, because ultimately, if you're not at the forefront of technologies, then no one will listen to you when you're trying to regulate it, or certainly no one will take you into account when it comes to the economic process.
Just to follow up on that, then, do they have a plan? Is it to get there, given how important it is your sense that they have a plan, or they're developing a plan to achieve it, or they're simply highlighting, this is very difficult, we need to be more innovative, there is a gap, we're losing that race, and it seemed not very substantive in terms of the discussion.
I don't really see a plan. I think it is, in a sense, a lament. It is about saying this is not good. But the problem with any concrete plan is the moment you start talking about policies, you also have to talk about the various national taboos, why we cannot move ahead in a number of different areas, and why we're not making progress, even on some of the most basic areas, let alone investing significantly into new technologies. Just to give one highlight here, what we have talked about for decades with the Capital Markets Union, or saving and investment, whatever we call it. This is about essentially making sure that we have a capital market which can supply investment into new technologies, into these cutting edge areas. And we're not making progress. That's the kind of thing we would have to make progress on if we were really serious about addressing technological sovereignty.
Janis, a word on this before we move on?
No plan, let alone a strategy. It's amazingly eclectic when it comes to what needs to be done, very national focused oriented. If you look into the three elements which were discussed, obviously simplification, competitive green transition, these were the things high on the agenda. It was not sovereign digital transition which was high on the agenda. And also, even if you look into the European Council conclusion, we need to strengthen Europe's digital sovereignty. I'm just quoting. We need a human-centric digital governance. We need to protect minors. That was politically, by the way, the issue which was mostly addressed and discussed. And there's a need for support and investment, as Fabian was saying. So this is very much a puzzle where you cannot see what actually shall come out of this at the end of the day.
Let us move on. I want to touch on two more issues before we draw some conclusions. We haven't talked about Gaza. Come back to that in a minute. But an issue, Janis, you mentioned at the beginning, an issue that was on the agenda that had never been on the agenda at EU level before, namely that of housing. What was discussed? What can the EU really do? And I'm minded when I look at the conclusion, and a lot of emphasis on having due regard for the principle of subsidiarity and national competences. And it seemed to me a bit of a contradiction. It said, the council conclusions say, we call on the Commission to present an ambitious and comprehensive plan for affordable housing. And then it says, having due regard to the principle of, so how can it be ambitious and comprehensive when they're basically saying hands off? My question really is, why did this come onto the agenda? Are they likely to do anything substantive? And if they're not, is this not a case of raising the public's expectations, suggesting the EU might be able to help? It's a very, very important issue for many EU citizens, when actually the EU can't do anything at all. I just wondering, it seemed a bit contradictory, that language.
I think it is contradictory because also the aim here is contradictory. On the one hand, there's an increasing understanding, and by the way, this is not something which is new. I remember us at the PC discussing this many years ago already, that there is a need to think more of issues related to housing, which can, by the way, encompass a lot of different things if you talk about housing. Um, but the fact that it made it to the European Council, that it made it on the European Council agenda, that it made it into the European Council conclusions, with all the caveats you mentioned, indicates that something will be done. But the question is, how much will you go in this direction? Again, because there's a fear that you might open up a box which you don't want to really open because this is very much a national sovereignty box. You also are, at least some at least, are worried about raising expectations which you're not able to live up to. So you need to already make sure that you have the expectations at the right level. And let's not forget, they only had 40 minutes. That's what we were told. 40 minutes of exchange on housing in a group of 27 plus the commission president and the president. That's not a lot. And even the council conclusion said, we discussed the various dimension of this pressing issue. I just quoted from the European Council conclusion. So this is an attempt politically to showcase that we have understood that this is an issue which is a real concern for our citizens. We want to reflect that at the European level. We will not do too much because this is not the competence of the European Union, but we will do something. But we need to be careful on how we communicate this.
So symbolically important, substantively not.
Now, but something will come out of it. Now, is it substantive in this in the sense that it is a game changer? This is not what anyone is talking about. Are there certain elements where there might be regulation? By the way, asking for more regulation while you're trying to simplify. But okay, that's another thing which you need to square the circle with. But I think this is what this has been all about. The Commission will come forward with proposal. Obviously, that's the job of the Commission, and it has been now asked by the European Council officially through the Council conclusion to come forward with certain proposals. And then let's see how far the member states will be ready to go. But they will try to use it politically because this is part of the anti-political efforts which they're doing.
Indeed. Fabian, I don't know whether you want to add anything or can we move on to Gaza?
Just one point. I think it's worth emphasizing this more horizontal point Janis just mentioned. At the European level, we have very few instruments but regulation. So whenever we read the Commission should, what that actually means is the Commission needs to propose more regulation. So at this moment in time, we have a deep contradiction because we're saying we should do less regulation, but we should do more regulation in a number of different areas. And those two don't go together, which is also why we have this continuing incoherence on competitiveness.
Indeed.
And by the way, we also need to complete the single market.
Okay, quick words if we go. I think we can do this relatively quickly, not because the issue is quick or easy, but because the EU's role, it seems questionable. On Gaza, we had the language we would have expected about welcoming the progress, the agreement reached on now the first phase, as it says, of the comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. We have a reiteration of the commitment to a two-state solution. We have a call for immediate access and without impediment to humanitarian aid. What you would expect from Council conclusions on the issue of Gaza. I'm just wondering, is there anything of substance in there? And if there isn't, is that simply reflecting reality? Does it matter that at this point the EU really is an observer of this and simply reiterating its known position over and over again? Janis?
To your list, I would have added, again, not a surprise, that they really try to convey the message, how grateful they are to the US president for achieving what he has achieved. And actually, in many ways, there's also belief that this is true. This is not only pretending. So it is partly tactic, but it's also more than that. Second, there are a huge number, and we all know them, of question marks with respect to whether the plan will actually be implemented and will be, quoting from the European Council, fully implementing all phases. So we're talking about 4 phases. We're still in phase 1, which already is extremely difficult. When it comes to disarming Hamas, phase 2, this is extremely difficult. And if we reach to phase 4, which is to actually find a way to reconstruct Gaza, to turn it into something else, there are big question marks as to whether we will ever get there. So there's also all these fundamental questions still out there in terms of whether the plan will be implemented. Having said all that, Europe's role, if we get to the point beyond now the humanitarian assistance, which is already being provided, to have a structural opportunity to change the fate of Gaza and its future, then the Europeans will be there to support. They will be there to support financially, they will be to support with knowledge, with whatever they can in order to support. And some members will be more inclined to do so than others, but collectively there will be a strong inclination to do so. But there is, again, the big question mark, will we ever get there? And if we get there, that is our role, because actually that is what our role has been in the past, and reflecting what we have done over the past years and our inability to have a joint position on the issue, that's the fate which we also will have in the future. I think we need to be realistic about this.
Fabian, quick one on this.
I think, yeah, the only thing we can say certainly is that the role which everyone sees Europe in is to pay. But when it comes to having real political influence or power, what this is showing very clearly is nobody's listening to what the Europeans are saying. I'm personally grateful that I don't have to thank Donald Trump because I think there are more things wrong with this deal, and also the timing of it is such that we should have been here much, much earlier, and he could have done that before now. But in the end, yes, it is positive that we had the hostages freed, that there seems to be a lull in fighting, even though it doesn't seem to be over completely. But the long-term future for Gaza, the question of the two-state solution, how do we find a permanent settlement which works for the wider region? All of these are as much in the air as they were before.
Indeed. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask each of you, and I'll start with Fabian this time, because I want to come back to when I said at the beginning, going back to the title of this update today, could the council move from division to delivery? And you said there was a decisive decision to decisively move forward. And Janis argued that in itself, that movement in itself was and can be judged as a form of delivery. But if we want delivery to be decisive decisions to actually do it, what do you think? Do you think December will mark yet another staging post on all of these issues we've been discussing this afternoon? Or are we moving to a moment where they will not only decide decisively to make a decision, but actually make the decisions that we need? How optimistic are you that this is going to translate into action, with all the caveats you talked about, why it's so difficult and why the movement itself is important? Do you see by the end of this year any substantive progress on the issues we've been talking about? Fabian first, Janis, I'm afraid it's 1 minute each. Your verdict on, are we going to get there?
We are going to continue to stumble forward, but it is a question of whether we have a gun put to our head or not. It seems to be that the only time when we really move is when there is no other alternative. We've had that before. I think we are in exactly the same logic, that what we are going to do, unless there's a real pressing need, which mainly will come across the Atlantic, is going to be too little, it's going to be too slow. We're not going to decisively address the scale and the scope of the challenges we face unless Donald Trump makes us do something which otherwise we wouldn't have done.
Janis.
I'll quote something from the very past and add something which is potentially a bit newer. ambitiously muddling through. That's what we're seeing, and we just need to be aware that this is what will continue to happen. And we will not have a decisive moment in December. We will not have a decisive moment in February or March or May and June, whatever it might be. There might be decisive and key decisions which will be taken, but this is how the EU is operating. But at the end of the day, and that's maybe the new element, because of the political constellations, not because of the analysis, the theoretical analysis, the actual fate of the EU in terms of its longer term development and historical, because Costa also was using is using these pictures, will be decided in the member states and with respect to political developments in the member states and especially in key member states. And if things go wrong there in one or the other, or in more than one or the other member states politically, that will be pushing pressure on Europeans in a way which we haven't seen thus far. And what we have been seeing now with Hungary will only be a minor incident compared to what is then potentially going to happen.
We will come back to these issues in our next update in November, and then, of course, the regular post-summit briefing and EPC update after the December European Council. But that is all we have time for today. Just to flag up a couple of events next week linked to the sort of issues we've been talking about. On Monday, we have an online EU democracy reform conversation on the future of enlargement and EU reform, the candidate's perspective, with the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. I'll have the privilege of moderating that, and Janis will be on the panel. So if you haven't heard enough from us already, please do join us for that very important discussion with the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. And on Thursday, a policy dialogue on assessing the Union's rule of law. And I mentioned Fabian's to the point commentary on Russia wants war. Do take a look at that as well. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Gentlemen, thank you as always. Have a splendid weekend, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.